Those today who are saying that Newman is this Trojan horse for modernism or liberalism, I just don't think they've read St. John Henry Newman. And I think anybody that does will notice that there is a clear connection between even the neo-Thomist school, but also the Catholic Church's dogma and what St. John Henry Newman is saying. He is somebody traditionalists, I think, should wholeheartedly embrace.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father John Lovell with another episode of Hope in the Desert. Today I have the great opportunity of interviewing a great hope in the younger generations, what they like to call Gen Z, Murray Rundus, as I like to call him, De Profundis. But before I get to Murray, I just want to let everyone know that this show is provided to you by Pelican Plus, as well as unprofitableservants.org. We do highly encourage you to go over to unprofitableservants.org, make a donation, encourage others to make a donation as well. Please like and follow on any platform that you see us on. If you're not currently on Pelican Plus, I highly encourage you to go over and take a look at the great content that we have. Even though I was in on the talks about Pelican Plus from the very beginning, even I am very much impressed with this type of talent that we have. One of those talents was Michael Haynes, who I interviewed last week, and now today, Murray Rundus, both of whom head up our news branch, Pelican Brief. And with that said, Murray, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be on here, Father. I appreciate the work that you do, and yeah, the work here at Pelican. We've got such a great team building up, and it's just great to be involved in such a thing.
Oh, and I mean, to be honest with you, for you to, and I'm going to embarrass him when he listens to this, but for you to be able to sit at the feet of Brian McCall and work with him on pretty much a daily basis. I wish all of us could do that. What a lot of people don't realize, and ladies and gentlemen, forgive me if you hear my grandfather clock chiming in the background. I forgot to turn it off, but we'll go with it. It's a nice sound in the background. Brian McCall is probably one of the leading lights in any generation for the
Hmm.
traditional movement, at least in the English speaking world. And I one time compared him to the successor of Michael Davies, and a priest friend of mine, Father Trico, who's been on this show, said, no, I think that Brian McCall is even head and shoulders above Michael Davies. And trust me, I am a huge fan of Michael Davies. That said, Murray, could you give us just a brief kind of biography of yourself? You're a very young man. You were in the acting world, both Broadway as well as Hollywood and Disney. What brought you to acting, and then what brought you from acting into the faith?
Yeah, I've had it's always a bit weird talking about my childhood to people because there's very little to relate with most people. But I was raised in a really pious and really amazing. I owe them everything. Protestant family, and my parents were musicians, but they were also funeral directors. So I had a very a bit of an odd environment growing up. And they were always invested in the arts and trying to encourage that in my sister and I, and that meant that it really grew up in the theater, in musical theater. And that's I really from a very young age, from like 6 or 7, I had been really honing that craft, singing, acting, everything that goes into theater. I got some really good lucky breaks. I ended up being on the Addams Family National Broadway tour. That led me to get connections in Hollywood and California, and I ended up on a Disney Channel show, The Gamer's Guide to Pretty Much Everything, with Cameron Boyce, that went on for a number of years. And really was at the end of that show, once that show finished up and afterwards, that I had been really disillusioned in my middle teenage years with what was going on around me, especially as I noticed that the environment kept being it kept developing more and more to what I knew was wrong interiorly, and I hated the entire environment. So really, as a way to try to figure out what was going on around me, figure out, because I'd grown up and this is what I had lived in is just this environment, figuring out what I wanted to do. I really just started going into the intellectual life, and I really was introduced into reading with liberal philosophers like John Locke and John Stuart Mill. I really took that in. I ended up apostatizing from Protestantism, but that led me to being in this intellectual world, led me on a relentless study, and that eventually led me to the Catholic Church, and then later the traditional Catholic movement that happened in 2018. And really ever since, it's been a really just discovering this whole new world, being led by such amazing people. Having that, you mentioned Brian McCall, having him really as a mentor in my previous work there at Catholic Family News, where I think we did really amazing work, and then now here at Pelican working with Brian Still. It's just been an amazing journey.
Oh, and it has been. And I like how you said apostatizing from Protestantism. That's kind of like saying being blessed or being cursed by the devil. It is obviously a blessing to leave
Yep.
Protestantism. And I know that you are a big fan, as I am, of the newly minted doctor of the church, St. John Henry Newman. But
Mhm.
before we get to that, I want to talk about a little bit about the struggle you went through in actually converting to the faith. You talk about your parents being morticians, but to be honest with you, and this is something only priests kind of know in great detail because we're constantly dealing with morticians and undertakers,
Yeah.
is that it's actually a vocation. I mean,
Mhm.
to bury the dead is a corporal work of mercy, and not many people have not only just the skill and the talent to do it, but the sense to do it.
Mhm.
I think most people are kind of afraid of the dead and dead bodies. And so, I have to say, whether I don't know if your parents are still Protestant or not, but to be able to offer that ministry, and it really is in one sense a ministry to families is amazing. And someone who has worked for many years in the restaurant industry and the hospitality industry, at the very top of that list is what morticians and mortuaries do for people. What undertakers do is to be able to bring that wonderful sense of service to a family. So kudos to your family for that. But please tell us in your conversion, correct me if I'm wrong. You even had to get a canon lawyer involved in order to receive the sacraments. Is that correct?
It was. So I really had, and you talk about a blessing and a curse. My leaving Protestantism again. It's wrong in the sense that I ended up having really a hatred for Christianity in general for a brief period, but of course it led me to the Catholic Church. That rejection of that. It's really the same thing here with my troubles entering the church. Is it did lead me to have a greater clarity about some of the problems that we face within the Catholic Church that I think other people really they don't give that clear of a grace. But I had a strange instance here where I was baptized, quote unquote, as a child growing up Protestant Baptist. And for those who might have grown up in Protestant denominations, well, the way baptisms are done, it varies widely depending on where you're at, what church you're at, who the pastor is. And mine was I was the pastor said the words, but had somebody else put me in the water. Had my father put me in the water, and that, of course, you're separating the matter and the form. It's invalid. It's an open and shut case. So when I first converted, though, I was told that, well, Protestant baptisms are valid, period. You need not worry. Don't trouble yourself over this. That's valid. And so I ended up being received into the Catholic Church through confirmation. That was an invalid confirmation, as I was not validly baptized. My Protestant baptism was not valid. Um, and eventually, I started to become troubled by this as I took on more of a role as an altar server, one of the head altar servers at our parish. I saw myself as being really involved in a lot of responsibility. I also started reading more liturgical books that started mentioning conditional baptism. That word conditional baptism, where a baptism was given to Protestant converts under condition if they were baptized in doubtful circumstances. So I brought this up to my pastor, and I had even done really some unique studies that had not been conducted yet. I went back to the AAS in the early 1900s, where there was a specific case with a nearly identical case as mine. I had that translated from the Latin; it had not been translated yet, so I had an AAS document that was translated. St. Thomas references this exact scenario as I had, says it's invalid. So I really had this long, 30-page document making my case why I needed to be baptized. And I was told, no, you cannot. The Protestant baptisms are valid. If we were to baptize you, it would be a scandal to the other churches. And we would be, it would be an offense, and it would be repeating a sacrament. So eventually I had to get further documentation from a canon lawyer. The priest that I was dealing with at the time, he had to there got to be a back and forth with canon lawyers, and finally I was given this after all of this pressure and many months. I was finally able to receive a conditional baptism. But that was, of course, after months of receiving the sacraments invalidly, being involved in such a mess, having this doubt in one's mind. Am I receiving uh, the Eucharist in a state of mortal sin or not? It was a nightmare, and that really is what led me to realize there is a serious crisis in the church, and what we cannot rely on anymore is what people might have been able to rely on in the 19th century or the early 20th century, going over, what your bishops say is gospel. What your local priest says, that's gospel. Well, it's really not that case anymore, because the formation's not there. There is this driving force to lead the church astray due to a motivation of ecumenism, and due to a motivation of liberalism, and that this is causing harm to one's faith and one's own spiritual life, that if one doesn't take action on his own, you're going to end up in deep trouble. So that's what really led me to the traditional movement, or at least be more inquiring about it through that nightmare scenario.
How old were you when you started this process of basically fighting for a valid baptism?
I think I was 16 at the time, 16 or 17. So I was very
Six.
young. It was crazy for a young guy to be involved like that. And the sad thing, Father, is that after this case was dealt with, this led to a number of other cases, some very high profile cases that use the term "we baptize you." It's another invalid baptismal form. Uh, because of this event that happened, and later an article that I wrote at the age of, I think, 16 or 17, for 1 Peter 5, this led to a firestorm where hundreds of people realized that they had invalid Protestant baptisms and were receiving the sacraments in an invalid way. And
Yeah.
so seeing that at such a young age, it was so overwhelming. But I am glad that God was able to use this as an opportunity to have all these other people realize that they had, erroneous circumstances involved in their reception into the Catholic Church as well.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that this question of can the minister use the word we instead of I in the formula for baptism actually had to go all the way to Francis's or now dicastery of doctrine of faith, and it wasn't Tucci Fernando that was head of the, I don't think so, head of the dicastery at the time. It was the Jesuit name can't, it's not coming to my head right now, but even under Francis' pontificate, they ruled no, it's invalid. And there were
Mhm.
at least one or two priests that I know of in the Archdiocese of Detroit. They had to literally become Christians. They were not priests. They were not confirmed. They were not baptized. Everybody thought that they were, and assumed that they were. And it's quite interesting because we're going to, in a little bit, talk about John Henry Newman, but I'll bring him up now. When he was brought into the faith, he was conditionally baptized. And
Yeah.
to be fair, at that time, I would say that there was probably very small doubt that the Anglican baptism was invalid because they were actually using the formulary now. But you have so many Protestants, sadly, even Catholics, that use the formulary, I baptize you in the name of the Creator, the Redeemer, and the
Yeah.
Sanctifier. Invalid. Or we baptize you. Or they don't pour the water at the right time or in the right place. It has to be poured on the head. We baptize you in the name, or I baptize you in the name of the Father, pour water, and the Son, pour water, and the Holy
Mm.
Ghost, pour water. And it's amazing how that happens. And I often tell people this that are kind of on the fence about tradition. Like, because again, we're just being told, just be obedient, just be obedient, just be obedient, not even knowing what that word means by the person saying it or the person listening, is that put the formulary for the new baptism, the Novus Ordo, side by side with the formulary for the baptism of the old rite, the
Mm.
traditional rite. Okay, and tell me which one you want in English. Even though it's obviously done in Latin in the old rite, at least most of it is, but just put the translations right next to each other and then say, which one do you want? And everybody's going to say the traditional rite, okay,
Right.
with the beautiful exorcisms, with the beautiful prayers and anointings, which is just minimal in the Novus Ordo. Now, are we saying that if you do the Novus Ordo correctly, that it's invalid? Of course we're not. All right.
Right.
Of course it's going to be valid. But the problem is that so many times people are not doing that. And we see that in the traditional world, there seems to be a fight going on of, you know, what sacraments do we take as valid and licit from the Novus Ordo, and which ones that we don't. Now, obviously, if we're going to put everybody into different groups, and I hate doing this, the sedevacantists would automatically say you have to be conditionally baptized, confirmed if you're a priest, conditionally ordained for all the sacraments, period, end of the discussion. There seemed to be a time when the society held to that view as well. They seem to have backed away the Society of Pius X, at least on conditional ordinations for priests. They just still do an investigation. They still
Yeah.
look into it. And I would honestly say that if I was ordained a priest by somebody like Theodore McCarrick, I would I would have serious doubt that I was actually ordained, because I would call into question his intention to actually ordain me a priest of Jesus Christ of the Catholic Church. Why do you think there's this fight in the church all of a sudden over something that should be really very simple? I mean, conditional baptism, conditional confirmation, conditional ordination is just simply saying we're eliminating a doubt. Why is it becoming this big thing of offending people all of a sudden?
Yeah. I think one thing to understand, and this is how I've come to understand, and I don't claim to have all of the answers, but this is how I have come to understand why there is so much division in ecclesiology. So how we view, the church in relation to we're looking at the Pope. This is why you have the sort of the Sedevacantist division, but also you have all of these divisions in regards to the sacraments. I'll even say this, even among Sedevacantists, you have a very heated debate about whether or not the new rite of baptism is valid or not. There's all kinds of divisions within their camp, and even on the new rite of ordination, there is significant division. New rite of confirmation, there's significant division in all traditionalist camps. So the reason why I think is that we need to understand that both of these things are actually quite underdeveloped when it comes to theology in general. I'm pretty confident in making that assertion. When it comes to sacramental theology and dogmatic theology, there has not yet been very clear statements in regards to how the relation between the church and how it determines whether a rite is a valid baptismal rite or not. There's a lot of of course, you have the very simple matter, form, and intention that is needed for your valid sacraments. But when it comes to the nitty gritty regarding the intention, this is the big disagreement behind Anglican orders and behind some other schismatic sacraments, it is an underdeveloped aspect within Catholic sacramentology, how we view the intention, which is really behind the both the question behind new rite of ordination and new rite of baptism. So this is something that unfortunately we don't have clarification on, because this gets to the second half of it. The magisterium has not been very clear and has not been uh, really used properly in the past 50 or 60 years. And this is something that I think the church would be ruling on in more normal times, maybe developing how do we understand the sacramental intention, developing that a little bit more, having statements that have magisterial weight behind it. But we just don't have that. And so right now we are in this state that's very confusing for lay people. And that's sort of, this is my conclusion behind this, is that we have to recognize that there's very little certainty in regards to matters of ecclesiology. I do not believe that we can reach a sort of moral certitude, as to use that very technical term, in regards to many matters of ecclesiology nowadays, and applying that to our current circumstances, but also some of these questionable circumstances with the sacraments. And so when it comes to a layperson who cannot be expected to know all of these things about dogmatic theology and sacramental theology, it requires one to be in a safe environment with well-trained priests, and that is really following that Vincentian canon of we're believing what has always been believed. And right now, that's a struggle for every single person to do, but it's one that I think every layperson has to take up their cross now, of find a safe environment where the priest has been trained in a proper setting, and obviously has a good grasp on sacramental theology, and then do what the church has always done uh, in regards to the Catholic faith. So it's a very confusing time to live in as a layperson, but I think acknowledging that there's more gray in the circumstances now, rather than insisting that everything has to be black and white, my way or the highway, I think that's quite necessary nowadays. In order to come to a safe, stable understanding as a layperson, and not spiral out of control. But do you agree with me there, Father? What do
Oh,
you make of that?
absolutely. And let me just add, when we talk about whether or not the Anglicans had valid orders, and Leo the 13th in the late 19th, early 20th century ruled on this, that they were utterly null and void. This is
Right.
how confusing it is. The reason why Anglican orders were judged by the Holy See to be null and void is because during their break from Roman Catholicism, from the See of Peter, they stopped using the proper rite for about 100 years.
Yeah.
And then after 100 years, they went, oops, we actually need this in order for it to be valid. And they put it back in, okay, the proper words. All right. And so when you get to the 19th century, this is 350 years after their revolt, their break from the Roman Catholic Church, they're arguing, hey, we're using the same formulary or pretty close to it. This should be valid. And so you have theologians on both sides going, wait a second, what's going on here? Why would it be invalid? And then it came to discover that they went for about 100 years without using it. And so they invalidated their entire quote unquote line of succession. And it was just completely invalidated. And then you also have the problem that a lot of people don't realize is that in the mid 20th century, the rise of ecumenism, Greek Orthodox bishops started to participate in Anglican consecrations and ordinations. Now, all
Yeah.
of a sudden, the question is, did they get valid orders again? So there is a lot of confusion out there with that. And I just find it amazing that before the Second Vatican Council, the church took a very strong position that if there's even the smallest doubt, let's eliminate it with conditional uh, granting of any of the sacraments that are in play. And now it's kind of this so liberal understanding is, oh yeah, of course it's valid because the Anglicans in their books they use the correct formulary, but they don't realize that the minister could be ignoring that, just as many Catholic ministers can be. And Father John Zulsdorf, Father Z, said this many years ago, and it's still true today, is say the black, do the red.
Yeah.
And we really have to get back to that. And so I don't I don't have any problem whatsoever, whether it is a priest or a layman who have doubts about what's happening, because take, for example, the priests, or who we thought were priests in the Archdiocese of Detroit. The only way they knew that they were invalidly baptism or baptized was because they were baptized in the age of camcorders when it was being recorded, and they had a tape of it. They would never have known otherwise,
Yeah.
and we have to realize that. And I always encourage the laity to look back, to look at pictures. If you have a video, take a look at that. Make sure that the formula is correct. And again, it's very simple, ladies and gentlemen. Is the minister has to say, "I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost," pouring water over the head 3 times. I mean, it's not that hard. And so we have to really start looking into that. But so you converted at what age? You said you started fighting about 16, 17 years of age. When did you finally receive, at what age did you finally receive the sacrament of baptism and confirmation
Yeah, I think I would have
validly?
been it would have been in one of those 2 years, when it's 16 or 17. I know I was 15 when I began the sort of, the inquiry process, but it was 16 or 17 when I was actually received those sacraments. I wanna mention one thing, Father, because I think this has been my struggle really ever since, receiving those sacraments. And I'll say this, I know there's probably some watching in a very similar circumstance, and I empathize with you greatly if you're going through this sort of sacramental doubt struggle. It's one of the most painful things one can go through.
Hmm.
The old manualists, moral manualists, used to speak about this, how this can cause real distress and spiritual devastation for people. And I know it really did. It completely changed the trajectory of my life. The reason that I think the traditional Catholic movement is so important nowadays is when we acknowledge that there is all of this doubt in regards to sacraments, and you know all of this question nowadays of, is that man a bishop, is he not a bishop, is the pope, those sorts of questions. Well, what needs to be understood is that everything still has to revolve around Jesus Christ. Now that might be, some people might say that's just, it's cliche. People just say that to seem pious, but I mean that in a real way of saying that everything must come back to a growth in our devotion and our response to God, to Jesus Christ, that growth in theosis, a transformation of one's soul. And if we forget about that and we make everything about uh, trying to have a complete moral certitude over every issue relating to the crisis of the church, wanting to have 100% certainty about every single. I mean, of course, we need certainty in regards to the sacraments, because that is the instrument of grace. But if we turn this into a sort of obsessive, compulsive uh, need to have absolute certainty in every single circumstance, we end up, I think, losing perspective over the bigger picture of, we're doing this to grow in devotion. And what has the church said are the means that we grow in devotion? It's the tried and true ways of our prayer life. That's the traditional way in the West. We especially have the Ignatian meditation. We have the Holy Rosary, the growth in mental prayer, the classic escalation from the purgative to the illuminative to the unitive way. And if we lose sight of that and we start becoming more about, are we getting absolute certainty in regards to the crisis in the church, or in all these different circumstances, then we're going to miss the big picture. And so what I would suggest to anybody who is really suffering through this time, I'll emphasize again, get to a stable environment that emphasizes these spiritual paths to grow in union with Jesus Christ, because that's really the only way out. There's going to be uncertainty no matter where you go. We have to focus on the cross and Jesus Christ.
Oh, absolutely. We have to stay so committed to that. And I think in this day and age, when both in and outside of the church, Catholics are being attacked for simply wanting to be Catholic, I
Yeah.
mean, I cannot believe that we're in an age now where people have to fight in order to kneel down and receive communion on the tongue. And
Yeah.
no, because I grew up in the 80s and 90s where it was always, well, it's an option. It's an option. If you don't want to receive on the hand, you don't have to. You can still receive with the tongue. To now, all of a sudden, especially since COVID, it's become, no, no, you have to do it this way. And what would be the term to use? This legalism and this
Yeah.
false obedience and misunderstanding of obedience that basically the bishop is the general and you're the private and you better just do whatever they say, period. That harkened back for me to a time, and this was before you were born, but this harkens back to me of a time of what people were saying about the abuse crisis. They knew about it
Mm.
and they just didn't say anything out of obedience. And it was just, it's not for me to say anything. And this cover up was allowed to happen for decades because of it. And the church paid, especially in this country, paid a very deep price, not just financially, but spiritually, morally. We kind of lost our center on all of that to the point now where the majority of Catholics do not practice any faith whatsoever. So that's something that we have to keep in mind. But why did you leave Hollywood? And that might seem a very easy question, but I ask it simply because you do see very devout Catholics, Mel Gibson, Jim Caviezel, who still act and
Mhm.
are very much known for their faith. But what led you out of the acting world into the journalistic world? What brought you to where you are now? Because you could have easily have become a Catholic and stayed faithful and said, "Well, I'm not going to accept this job. I'm not going to accept this job. I'm going to stick to certain roles." But you decided to just leave the game altogether. Am I correct?
Yeah, you are. I mean, look, I still have a love for the arts. I love Shakespeare. I love the theater even. But the thing that really got me was after the show had finished, I as I mentioned earlier, I started to see that the roles that I was really having to go out for, because there's a lot of responsibility on child actors and the family that is surrounding the child actor as well. That's the business at that point, and that's quite a lot. And I realized that in order to stay in that, there were roles that I didn't want to have to take, and that especially during that period of time, that was sort of the height of woke, as people say, this sort of uh, the degeneracy in the culture had really, I think, reached a pinnacle point where there was also very little resistance, and you started to see mass sexualization in media, even sexualization of children. That disturbed me. There was, and so it was really some of that, and realizing that fundamentally I was not satisfied with what was going on around me. I was not finding a meaning of life. Really, ever since I was a kid, I always thought that I needed to sort of make my mark on the world. I didn't want my life to go to waste. But now I was realizing, well, if this is there has to be something deeper than just making frivolous entertainment. And so my switch really, it really began when I started to read, which I know people in the trad world, if you grew up in the trad world, you're probably reading from a very young age, but that took a conscious decision on my part. I ended up, as I mentioned, really going into the intellectual life through a political movement at the time called the Liberalists, which was promoting classical liberalism and really trying to get young guys to read these classical liberal writers like Locke, like Mill. The first real work I ever read was in a study program with this political group, reading Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, which was it's a blasphemous book. It tries to disprove, but it's a classical work that taught me how to read. it's trying to disprove the Bible through pointing out the contradictions. This was written in the the at the height of the French Revolution, and then really promoting deism as a response to Christianity. We need an enlightened man who can find God really on his own. And so it was through that I started to realize even further that wasn't satisfying. I thought classical liberalism, even though I was really surrounded by it, this was not answering the main questions that I had. It was not answering the personal search for uh, meaning that I was looking for, and that took me to uh to religion. And if I can mention something, I know we're rather short on time, but I'll mention something real quick. That the way I came about the Catholic Church is I grew up in this Protestant family. I met with a family member who was a Presbyterian pastor, and he gave me a work by an apostate priest, Catholic priest, who was an apostate and was a modernist. And he had written this book really talking about how those old Catholic devotions were keeping people in the mud, refusing to eat meat on Fridays. That's superstitious. We need to transcend all that stuff. I had never heard of any of those so called superstitions. And reading that work made me go, well, I think this modernism stuff is garbage. It's not answering my question. But what he's talking about, what he's talking against, that's interesting. That led me to read St. Augustine. That led me to read more of the church fathers and eventually sacred scripture. And that led me to the Catholic Church. And I've always really seen it as sort of a continuity of this search for the truth, search for a response to the culture that we're living in today, and trying to find fulfillment in that. Really, the only solution that I think people can come to, and I think everybody will come to this if you do enough searching, is we must have a response to liberalism that involves the spreading of Catholicism. I think those two things in tandem, having an anti-liberal Catholic point of view, that's really the only way we're going to get out of this muck of a culture that we're in and actually find personal fulfillment, because it not only heals society, it heals souls. And that's the answer that I think Catholicism brings to the liberal culture that we live in today.
We have about 14 minutes left, and I want to dedicate this to one of my favorite saints. And I assume, I'm assuming here, just based on your work, that you're a big fan of St. John Henry Newman, and you might have a devotion to a another great doctor of the church. We have so many of them, and obviously, I think it should go without question that any Catholic, whether they're an academic, whether they're just somebody who is just wanting to learn more about the faith, let's clear the air on a few things. You should be devoted to the church fathers, to St. Thomas Aquinas automatically. I mean, that, when somebody
Yeah.
says to me, you know, I asked them what brought you to become a Dominican or a Franciscan or something. When they give me the answer, the Holy Ghost, I already know that. All right, what did the Holy Ghost do in order to bring you to these charisms and stuff? But it seems like you have a profound love for Saint John Henry Newman. I mean, you were just talking about anti-liberalism. I mean, at least in the English speaking world, in the last 200 years, he is certainly the one that does that. But what is your take on John Henry Newman? And then also, if we can get a little controversial here, why do you think some trads have a problem with him?
Well, look, this is something that there's certainly a lot of stuff already to critique in this Leonine Pontificate, the latest document on Our Lady, which I thought was despicable in many places. But when it comes to Pope Leo XIV, him giving the role of Doctor of the Church to Saint John Henry Newman, I think not only is this a tremendous thing in the church that traditionalists should rally around, I also think it's a sign of hope that we might see um, Pope Leo be more sympathetic to classic traditionalist critiques of the post-conciliar world, especially if you look at his homily about making St. John Henry Newman a doctor. But why do I see St. John Henry Newman is important, and really what's that relationship with St. Thomas? Well, I think the important thing to get is that as you mentioned, St. Thomas Aquinas is the universal doctor of the church. He is this is very clear. There is multiple documents that uh, people can look to: Studiorum Ducem, Doctorus Angelici. St. Thomas is the doctor of the church, and Thomism really should be the default position of a Catholic. And when it comes to, these complex theological and philosophical topics like middle knowledge and predestination, I would be a Thomist in that sense. Something I think St. John Henry Newman adds to that, though, and that I think really makes him an important figure for the modern age, is he is looking at a different part and different aspect of Catholicism that allows us to speak to the modern world in I think, a much more uh, firmly apologetic stance where we can be on more firm ground. But also, when it comes to the traditional Catholic point of view, I think we can gain greater perspective looking at the crisis in the church by looking at what he has to say about the church fathers, but also how he related the church fathers to his own point in life, leaving Anglicanism and joining the Catholic Church. There's parallels in both of those instances, and I'll explain what I mean. St. John Henry Newman was a he had a deep love for the church fathers, for the patristic period, but also just church history in general. This is what eventually led him out of the Anglican Church and into in communion with Rome. Is that he had a keen insight, realizing that in the first millennium, you had all of these different heretical movements that would pop up, mainly dealing with Christology, but also dealing with ecclesiology. So dealing with our Lord, but also the theology behind the church. And he noticed that they're usually formed three camps. There was the heretical camp. So we might think of this as just Arianism, right? Arius
Mhm.
comes around, the Arian camp, that's the firmly heretical camp. Then he noticed that there was the opposite extreme, which is the Orthodox camp. So what we would think of today is recognizing that our Lord is divine and is still fully human. But then he noticed that there always seemed to be a middle camp, which was claiming to be in the middle of both. But he said that it's always heretical. Now, this he compared to his own circumstance, and he noticed that there was this camp of Protestantism, Catholicism, and then the middle camp of Anglicanism, the Via Media, the middle way he called it. And he realized the analogy really worked, and that this compromise wasn't going to work. You either had to be Orthodox or heretical. So looking at that analogy, I think, is very important to today, because we have a number of instances where I do not think Catholics can compromise on when it comes to dealing with modernism, when it comes to dealing with a distorted view of ecumenism, thinking that all religions are pathways to God, in an unqualified sense. That this is something that simply must be rejected. Is Catholicism must insist that outside of the church there is no salvation. Now, there's qualifications that you can read Gary Lagrange on, for example, but we must insist on that point. We must insist that error has no rights, and we must insist on today that there is uh, the church cannot overturn what has always been holy, and at the next moment say, this is unholy. This is something that is evil. That's rejecting fundamentally a version of modernism. And the final thing I'll point out is to wrap things up, and how we can really use St. John Henry Newman to communicate to the world properly. Well, St. John Henry Newman is a very eclectic figure, which is why I'm very attracted to him. There's a form of Thomism that I do think can become imposing, because it's not actually reading St. Thomas. It's reading what people think is the Thomistic school. But if you read even in the early 20th century, Maritain, even Gilson, Deconic, these people are adjusting Thomism in a way that is looking back to what St. Thomas said, but also adapting it to the modern problems that we're facing. And that's something St. John Henry Newman could do very well. He wasn't simply repeating what the schools had always said, but he was looking at his modern circumstances, looking at analogies from the past, and informing his present circumstances with principles that have been given to him by the church and by these great theologians. That's the call that traditionalism must do today. Traditional Catholicism must not be simply accepting on we believe these things because that's what is believed. We have to look at the principles. We have to relate it back to our Lord Jesus, and we have to draw from and we have to apply them properly to today in order to grow in sanctification. So that's how I think Thomism and St. John Henry Newman can both be reconciled, and why I think both of them are really important for the traditional Catholic movement.
Can I go even a step further? I don't think a lot of people realize this. I was canceled halfway through my studies at Dominican House of Studies. I was working on a license and doctorate in sacred theology at the time, and my Tessina or little thesis was comparing what St. Thomas says on conscience as well with Newman. And I am no great theologian. I will be the first to say this, but I will say this is I think that when people start saying things like, well, he's not a Thomist, whether it's about Newman or anyone for that matter, I think the saints like St. Thomas Aquinas and St. John Henry Newman would smile and kind of give each other a look like they don't understand. Um, because St. Thomas is clearly the the greatest, the hands down in any language, St. Thomas is the greatest authority on the church fathers. All right.
Yeah.
And St. John Henry Newman is clearly, hands down, the greatest authority in the English speaking language on the church fathers.
Mhm.
And what a lot of people don't realize is that Leo the 13th is the one that really brought Thomism back. And
Yeah.
at the same time, right around the same time, he promoted Newman to the College of Cardinals, you know. And
Yeah.
so what Leo what we should really look to is what Leo the 13th is trying to tell us that that you know we shouldn't necessarily be caught up in uh these distinctions when it comes to, well, who's a Thomist and who's not a Thomist, is really is who is connecting well with the church fathers. All right. And if Newman is looking at the church fathers in a different way, but still orthodox than St. Thomas, that is all right. And St. Thomas would be the first one to say that. I mean, look, his closest friend was St. Bonaventure, who, correct me if I'm wrong, most people, when Bonaventure and Thomas were alive, they were contemporaries, most people would say that Bonaventure was probably the better theologian. He was not a
Yeah.
Thomist, you know, he was not a Thomist. And uh, we have to realize that, and we have to realize that just because somebody does not have that same train of thought doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad. I hope I'm making sense on that. It's just something
No,
that
you
that is
are.
always
Yeah.
it's something that's always bothered me. You know, I mean, and even Alphonsus Liguori is the same way. You know, with his moral theology compared to Thomism.
Yeah, and it's something that I wrote an article not too long ago speaking about Saint Bonaventure. This is something that there did become a sort of decadence that entered the Catholic Church before the council, and this is what Newman encountered when he went to Rome. This is what he was sort of discouraged by, which is sort of saying refusing to engage with the other schools from the perspective of Thomism. This is something that the Nouvelle Theologie, even though they distorted this and they capitalized on this in I think an unfair way. They used Saint Bonaventure in order to sort of try to bring some of their anti-Thomistic ideas into the Catholic Church. This is to a lesser example because I think Ratzinger is one of the better ones of this sort of way, but his thesis was on St. Bonaventure. But these people disagreed. St. Bonaventure and St. Thomas, especially in regards to presuppositionalism. How do we know God? Does everyone have a sort of interior innate knowledge of God? There's disagreements on this. The important thing is that we're all relating this to the principle of dogma. We're submitting it to the judgment of the church, and that we are uh, not falling into the errors of liberalism and modernism. And that's something that Newman was against for all of his life. Even as an Anglican, he was against modernism and liberalism. That was one of his main points being involved in that movement. So those today who are saying that Newman is this Trojan horse for modernism or liberalism, I just don't think they've read St. John Henry Newman. And I think anybody that does will notice that there is a clear connection between even the neo-Thomist school, but also the Catholic Church's dogma and what St. John Henry Newman is saying. He is somebody traditionalists, I think, should wholeheartedly embrace.
And as we come to a close, I just want to add for anyone that, especially if you're a traditionalist who is seeking the truth, read Newman's Biglietto speech, his acceptance of the cardinal's hat, all right, of where he stands, in addition to what not only Leo the 13th says about him, but also St. Pius X, as well as Pope Benedict the 15th. I strongly encourage the book, A Preface to Newman's Theology by Father Edmund Bernard. It's a short little book. It's also, in my opinion, a pretty easy book to read
Yeah.
for even lay Catholics, and a realization that we have to, whether we're 5 or 105, as Mother Angelica would say, we have to become better Catholics. And ladies and gentlemen, I was mentioning this at the beginning of the show, and I just want to kind of conclude with that, and then I'll give Murray, as I like to call him, De Profundis, the last word. Is that my bringing back this show, and we're starting off small. I do not have the audience I had before I went on hiatus. The three most popular shows, well, the two most popular shows, I hope this is the third popular show, are all with young men, all right, that are under the age of 25 or thereabouts, that are trying their best to be best Catholics. And I'm glad to see that from the audience response. So please follow not only this show on Pelican Plus and on YouTube, but also the Pelican Brief, which Murray is now running along with Michael Haynes. I like to say you have an American and a British perspective when it comes to Catholic news. And keep canceled priests in your prayers. If you would like to see more of this show, or if you would like to help canceled priests, please go to unprofitableservants.org. Again, all one word, unprofitableservants.org. Murray, any last words?
Yeah, we live in a time of great uncertainty today, especially for young people and those who really want to get engaged in the culture. There is a great real there needs to be a realization, I believe, that as I mentioned earlier, that a sort of black and white um, thinking about everything is not going to be the way out of this. We need to have a reasoned. We need to recognize that, as Bishop Williamson said, at most of the crisis today is not black and white, but it is a whole lot of gray. I think realizing that, informing our perspectives by charity and a deep seeking of understanding of what is going on in the church, and again motivated by that sense of charity, that is how I think we're going to get out of this. If we come out if we come out of this crisis with a deeper understanding of our theology, our philosophy, our ecclesiology, and that is motivated by a sense of love for God and for our neighbor, that is how I think we can use this crisis as a point to really turn things around and bring the church to a better state. So we can use this as an opportunity. We just have to really follow those principles of understanding motivated by charity.
Amen. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching Hope in the Desert. I am Father John Lovell. We will see you next time. God bless.